Thank you, Eileen. I'm pleased to be back in Illinois. I thank you for your introduction. And I recall a conversation with a student not too many years ago. We were talking about World War, and I finally said to him, which war, though, are you talking about, the first or the second? And he stopped, and he said, you mean there were two? And I said, yes, there were two. So we historians have a lot of work to do and have to continue to do it. I've enjoyed my visit to these wonderful facilities here in Springfield. Eileen, you were a great guide. Brian was a great guide this morning as well over in the library. And it's good to be back here in Illinois with the prairies that you think of as Illinois, and of course the bluff country that I think of as Illinois up in the northwestern part of the state in Galena. I have a long interest in Abraham Lincoln. The first paper I ever did in school was on Lincoln. I have an old bust of Abraham Lincoln that one of my aunts gave me many, many years ago that has always remained on the shelf next to my desk. And in fact, I lived in Galena about a half a block from the DeSoto Hotel, which is still the same building that it was in the early 19th century, and President Lincoln actually not then president, he spoke in 1856 on a balcony of this hotel right down the street from where I lived. And my work as a professional historian has not been on Lincoln, but my interest and regard for him remains. And unlike perhaps any heroic historic figure, the more you know of Abraham Lincoln, the more you respect him. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the movie this weekend, the Spielberg movie that has just come out. But let me tell you a little bit about this book and how this book evolved, those who have borne the battle. I'm not a military historian. My professional work as a historian had been on politics and the westward movement. I had written books on populist period. I had written a book on progressivism. And indeed, my first book was the opening up of the lead mines up in Galena. I'd worked in the mines after I got back from the Marines, and I had a great interest in this, and we discovered some materials up at the Galena Public Library, and I ended up doing first my undergraduate thesis and then a master's thesis, which became a book on the Galena Lead District. But I did grow up with an interest in history, and it was hard to grow up in Galena in that post-war period without having an interest in history, without having an interest in General Grant and the Civil War and Cannons in the Park, as the title I use for the introductory chapter of this book, talking there specifically about the Blakely rifle, which sits on the grounds of Grant Park in Galena. It was the first rifled cannon in the United States. A group of South Carolinians in London had sent it to the South Carolina militia late in 1860, and the Blakely rifle was used in the assault on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. It was captured in 1865 by a regiment, a lead mine regiment from the Galena area with General Sherman, and it went to the Rock Island Arsenal. And then finally in 1896, it came up to Grant Park in Galena, where it remains. In fact, I've heard over the last number of years, including a year ago, we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. The citizens of Charleston wanted to borrow the cannon for display down there for the celebration, and the citizens of Galena declined to send it back down to South Carolina, so it remains in Grant Park. Galena in those years was post-war America. And it was a post-war America where everyone seemed to have served in the military. I think that the figures that I have pulled out, 798 Galenians served in the war and 18 died there. The 1940 census only showed 4,100 people living in Galena, so it was just a significant portion of the population, including my father. My senior high school trip from Galena High School was in Washington. We stopped at Gettysburg on the way to Washington, and 4 of my high school classmates and I had a picture taken at the Marine Corps Memorial in Arlington. And within a month after that, right after graduating from high school, we joined the Marines. More of us joined the Marines out of Galena High School that year among the boys and went on to college. So I did have a background, I guess, that in some ways led me in the direction of this book, but when I stepped down as president of Dartmouth in 2009, I was not intending to write a book. I told people I was not. But I was committed to working with veterans of our current wars and to understanding better the way in which our obligations for them and to them had evolved. And this resulted from several converging factors that all came together to result in this particular book. Beginning in 2005, I have been visiting military hospitals, primarily Walter Reed and Bethesda Hospital in Washington. I was down to what's now a single hospital, as you may know, and I was down there in late September, and I'll go down again in the next month. I typically go down sometime before the Christmas holidays to visit the hospital, and I think I've been down there about 30 times. When I go, I go bed to bed, and I talk to the young men and young women who are there, most of them hospitalized in those hospitals with some significant conditions, and I try to encourage them to go back to college. I try to encourage them to continue with their education. And I worked to set up a counseling program for them with the American Council on Education. Over the last 5 years has provided counseling for several hundred patients in the hospital, a number of whom have already graduated from their colleges. I also worked in 2008 on the GI Bill with Senators Webb and Warner, the post 9/11 GI Bill, to fill a real void. The peacetime GI Bill that was then in place was not adequate to provide support for college for the men and women who are getting out of the military. And finally, Senator Webb's bill was approved and signed by President Bush in June of 2008. In 2009, my wife Susan and I visited Normandy, visited a friend there, and we spent some time at Omaha Beach in the cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer. And as I recall so vividly, and many of you I'm sure have been there, walking through that cemetery and just being struck by the crosses and the Stars of David, memorializing all of the individuals. But as I walked row by row through that cemetery, looking at the names on the markers, it would tell when they were born, how old they were, when they died, and where they're from. But I wanted to know more about them. I wanted to know who was this 18-year-old from Kansas that died on June 8th, 1944. What was he doing? What did he want to do? We need to know more about him. And this feeling was reinforced a couple months after that. On Veterans Day of 2009, I was invited to speak at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. And I went down there and I talked about the Vietnam Memorial, and I talked about the names that we remembered there. There were over 58,000 of them. It was a chilly, drizzly Washington day. It wasn't very pleasant, and my recollection was how the space was still filled, basically with comrades of those whose names were on the wall, and also with Gold Star mothers sitting up in the front who literally dazzled wearing white on this dreary day. And I talked there about a couple of names on the wall. One of them was Mike Lydon from Galena. When I worked in the mines, I worked for his dad, who was my boss. And then when I was going to school at Platteville, I taught at Galena High School, and Mike Lydon was a student of mine in an English class. And Mike Lydon died on Hamburger Hill with the 101st Airborne in May of 1969. And I talked about all of us there needing to remember these names on the wall, because the generation who knew those who had served and died in Vietnam were passing along. And we need to make certain that people never forgot who they were, because people who send our young to wars need to know that these are real people with real dreams and aspirations and ambitions that are going off to war. And then finally, in that first year, after I left the presidency, I was invited to give the Jefferson Lecture at the University of California, Berkeley. And the faculty committee had asked if I would talk about some of my work with veterans, since I have been doing this now for 4 or 5 years. And I said I will, but I'm a historian, and I'm curious to know more about the history of this country's relationship with its veterans, and I'd like to talk about that some. And I was quite surprised to discover that there weren't a couple or three books that basically would provide this overview of this history. And I was complaining about it, and a friend of mine said, quit whining and write the book yourself. So I decided I would do exactly that. I was interested in providing a historical overview of the way that Americans have thought about war and how we've treated those who have fought our wars, ranging from the American Revolution to the current war in Afghanistan. I wanted to share my perspective in this book as a historian. I wanted to talk about what it is we had done historically, but I also wanted to talk about my experience over the last several years working with veterans of our current wars. The book is titled Those Who Have Borne the Battle, and you will know in this room, many of you, that this is language from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, in which he was affirming in March of 1865, affirming at the end of a cruel war our nation's obligation to those who served. It was perhaps one of the most eloquent addresses of this remarkably eloquent man, and he concluded his speech with generosity and yet with resolution. And you've all heard the language, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. President Lincoln reminded us in this conclusion to his inaugural address that the end of a war initiates rather than it concludes a national obligation to those who fought. And so when I wrote this book, I wanted to talk about this obligation, what it had meant. And I do talk in the introductory chapter about my own background briefly and reflect on it. And I talk there about the Blakely rifle, this cannon in Galena Park. And I'd read for you those a couple of short paragraphs on this. When the Blakely rifle was formally accepted at Grant Park in Galena in 1896, one of the park commissioners noted that these monuments were a, quote, sure means of keeping alive the martial spirit which has been awakened by past triumphs. Now, it's not clear that the cannon ever evoked such feelings. They did not for me and for my generation. Cannons rest quietly in many parks and many places in the United States. They are souvenirs and they are trophies. But removed from their bloody context and spiked from ever again thundering their lethal intent, they are as silent as statuary and as inviting as playground equipment. They should also serve as reminders that war can touch quiet places and peaceful communities. These weapons say little about the horror of war, but within our peaceful playgrounds and parks, they whisper that it is best to remember some things that many would prefer to forget or even never to learn. Let the children play, but also allow the rusting ordnance to provide quiet reminders. Wars are not games, and they surely are not pleasant experiences for those who fight them. And this is what my book tries to address and to reflect upon. These artifacts sometimes remind us of things that we just soon forget. In the book, I've sought to provide a historical overview of wars. I've tried to personalize some things that really resist personality. And I consider the consequences of the decline of the citizen soldier, as exaggerated as this concept may have been historically. My generation, I was born in 1939, my generation observed the World War II veterans, including my father, return home. Their war saluted and celebrated. These veterans seemed to fit easily into the heritage of the citizen soldiers, rooted in our national narrative beginning with the American Revolution. We considered this the American way of war. Rather than a professional military, throughout our history, when the Republic was threatened, Americans moved from farm and factory and shop, put on uniforms, and picked up the weapons of war. As soon as the war was over, they moved quickly back to their civilian pursuits. On the eve of World War II, American presidents from George Washington down to then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had affirmed this model. George Washington, during the American Revolution, spoke of the obligation of all citizens. Every citizen, he stated, who enjoys the protection of a free government owes not only a proportion of his property, but even of his personal services to the defense of it. Now, this principle of obligation, a belief that was shared widely by the revolutionary generation, became a cornerstone value. Moreover, we began even thinking it was factually the case. From Lexington and Concord to Gettysburg to Belleau Woods to the Battle of the Bulge, American citizens have stood at the ready to any who would challenge us. In 1940, when European war threatened to engage the United States again, Senator Bob Reynolds of North Carolina warned Hitler not to take lightly American boys who grew up with squirrel rifles in their hands. Now, as someone who did grow up as a squirrel hunter on the hardwood bluffs and hills outside of Galena, I have to acknowledge that it never occurred to me that I was prepared to take on a Panzer division. Needless to say, that is not the point, nor is it the national narrative. Americans are reluctant warriors, the story tells us, but they are ready when called upon, and in the telling, they have stepped up for their country's wars, and just as soon as they're able, they return to their civilian lives. In truth, the story was always a bit exaggerated. George Washington, as early as the American Revolution, had expressed great frustration with the militia who were called up by the various colonies to fight. They were not prepared for the long haul. They were not prepared for the training and the discipline and the deprivation that they would suffer. They were prepared to defend their own farms and homes and then go back to plow the fields. And so he wanted a regular army, and the Continental Army was founded as a result. And most of the colonies had to resort to all sorts of devices to get enough men mobilized to fight war. The Civil War was marked by bonuses and bounties, by community and group pressure. Whole communities would come together, as the Lead Mine Regiment up in Galena did, that marched off with General Grant, not then a general, of course. And finally, after all the group pressure, a draft. Early on in the Civil War, recruits from all segments of society enlisted with a sense of optimism and naivete about the duration and bloodiness of the war. This was not sustainable, and Lincoln and others had to work hard to try to sustain this sense of optimism and of purpose. World War I, of course, did have a draft, and it was largely successful in placing in the field an army that represented a cross-section of American society. But World War II really was a model, an example of the power of the citizen soldier. There was a massive mobilization during the Second World War. By war's end, on land and sea and air, Americans fought bravely and well in a very cruel war. The 12% of our population that was in uniform represented a more significant proportion of the population than any of our previous wars, excepting the Civil War. And the mobilization was induced by a massive compulsory draft, to be certain. Indeed, by 1942, they no longer were taking enlistments. It was only the draft that was a means of generating the personnel they wanted. They had stopped doing enlistments because they didn't want these young men picking the branch of service they were serving in. They wanted to draft them and allocate them that way. And so anyone who was draft eligible could not enlist. The 17-year-olds were not draft eligible, but they're old enough to enlist with parental permission. And that's why certainly by 43, 44, the Marines and the Navy were much younger than the Army, because a lot of 17-year-olds join the Marines because they did not want to wait for the draft, as I did at age 17. The mobilization of the war was widely accepted and applauded during World War II. But beginning with the Korean War, which began in 1950 and lasted from 1950 to 1953, beginning with the Korean War, those who have fought America's wars have been increasingly less representative of our society. During World War II, if anything, Americans from wealthier neighborhoods, Americans with neighborhoods of higher education, were more likely to serve and more likely to be casualties during the war. And I think that a major factor in the latter, a major reason for the latter, is that we lost so many men who were part of airplane crews over Europe as well as over the Pacific, but particularly over Europe. And the people who were on the crews, the pilots, the co-pilots, the navigators, the key men in these crews, did indeed come from communities that were better educated. Most of them had college, if not college degrees already. But Korea, there's no longer even as much talk of this. Beginning with the Korean War, it was possible to have a deferment from the draft if you're enrolled in college. It was not across the board, it was up to the local draft boards. But you can begin to see this. And they continued to have enlistments during the Korean War. And enlistments always end up bringing in troops, bringing in young men who are coming from less affluent parts of our country. That's just a fact of life. And so there's not much mention anymore even about the citizen soldier. Vietnam was a blue-collar war. There was a draft, but it was a blue-collar war. It was a war of young men, 19 and 20-year-olds that were in the front lines in Vietnam. Increasingly, more of them were draftees. And beginning in 1973, we have had an all-volunteer military. There's no more emphasis upon service as a citizen's obligation. I'm not sure people even talk about that anymore. And surely no political figure ever reminds us of General Washington's insistence that citizens of this republic owe some part of their property when that nation is at war. Indeed, every war in our history, down to our current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, has had a special tax passed by the Congress, allocated to help pay for that war. These wars, of course, nobody even talks about. Is anyone talking about taxes? I pointed out in a column I wrote in early October that we spent a lot of time in this country talking about the privileged 1%. And a lot of the debate in the election campaign and continues to be is whether that 1% should pay a higher rate of taxes, whether that 1% is protected and privileged while the 99% of us work harder than them. The great irony in this, I pointed out in this piece that I wrote, is that there's another way where that same ratio works but reversed. 99% of us are privileged in this country, as 1%, really less than 1% of us, has served in these wars. 99% of us have never had to worry about a knock on the door at night or a telephone call telling us that something had happened to our son or daughter over in the mountains of Afghanistan. We have been protected. We have been privileged from this. And we have not paid taxes for it, so these young men and women who are fighting these wars can come home and spend the next 20 years paying off the debt for the wars that they fought. Historically, this would not have been acceptable to Americans. We've been very quiet in this war on this very subject. I've also in this book tried to describe how from the Civil War on, there have been, of course, some fundamental changes in the scale of war. Obviously, what we're seeing more and more, not including these current two wars, but large armies in the field. And this results cruelly in impersonal, almost abstract scope of tragedy, and indeed the increased anonymity of war. In ironic ways, as many of these are faceless on a battlefield, none are known outside of family and community, we simply call all of them heroes and proceed with our daily lives. Two examples of this point that I'm making has to do with the scale of tragedy at Gettysburg and Iwo Jima. At Gettysburg, In the first 3 days of July in 1863, 170,000 men fought. There were over 50,000 casualties there, and nearly 8,000 were killed at Gettysburg. Iwo Jima, battle in the South Pacific in February of 1945, when the Marine 1st Division went on to Iwo Jima. There were 30,000 Marines that went into Iwo Jima and fought there for about 3 weeks. 22,000 casualties of the 30,000 Marines. 6,000 of them were killed on Iwo Jima. 29% of the Marines who were killed in World War II died on Iwo Jima. Essentially all of the 20,000 Japanese defenders of that island were killed. Modern wars are robbed of individualism, and political leaders and narrators in wars with great sacrifice increasingly do not dwell so much on sacrifice but on purpose and on the common heroism that's shared by all who fight. They sometimes are trying to hide the human costs, but they are also finding the individual accounting secondary to the shared national purpose. The rationale, the reason, not the blood, becomes paramount in trying to discuss and describe and rationalize and mobilize for war. And there are iconic examples of this. One, of course, that's very familiar to people in this room is the Gettysburg Address, one of the most remarkable addresses in American history. But in writing this book, I thought more about the Gettysburg Address. I thought more about what President Lincoln had said, and I was so moved today, Brian, when you showed me a copy in Lincoln's handwriting of the Gettysburg Address. It is such a powerful statement. But remember, and I won't read the entire thing, although it only took him a few minutes, and I could read it, I suspect, as fast, if not as well. But I just want to remind you of some of the language of President Lincoln in November of 1863 on the Gettysburg battlefield. This was following the fight there in the first 3 days of July. President Lincoln said, "We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." What a remarkable statement, how remarkably eloquent. But if you think of that address and read through it again, there are no names there. There are no heroes. There's no blood, even as the president was surrounded by reminders of death. President Lincoln knew better than any American, perhaps, that the Civil War meant awful personal losses. He met often with wounded veterans of some of the bloodiest battles that had ever been fought, and he expressed to them his gratitude and his support. Observers often noted his haunted and sad eyes as this war continued. When the ambulances returning the wounded soldiers from the siege of Petersburg back to Washington passed him by, he turned away from looking at them, stricken and uttering, "I cannot bear it. This suffering, this loss of life is dreadful." He walked in the funeral procession for women who died in an arsenal explosion in Washington, and he saw their distraught family members desperately pushing through the crowds to seize the coffins. You only need to read his comments to the Sanitary Commission in Philadelphia in June of 1864, his deep condolences to Mrs. Bixby, to understand how moved he was by this. But when Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg Address, some bodies of the soldiers were still visible, some body parts were still visible, lying in shallow graves around this battlefield. And the stench of death remained in the air in November of 1863. Nonetheless, President Lincoln does not dwell on the sacrifices of these people, each of whom has a story, each of whom had dreams and aspirations, but instead his focus in this address is to clarify the purposes for which they died. His speech was really addressed to the living. It was a purpose for which others now must be prepared to die. The Gettysburg Address is less a eulogy than it is a rededication, a recommitment. President Lincoln urged Americans to make certain that the fallen have not died in vain. And I'm often struck by how in less deft hands than President Lincoln's, because what President Lincoln was saying here, that there is a broad national purpose that requires sacrifice. Too often, this "let's make certain that they have not died in vain" is repeated to sort of explain or to justify why fighting or a war must continue. So rather than purpose defining sacrifice, sacrifice now defines purpose. We must continue fighting. The Iwo Jima Monument. There was some controversy at that time in the early 1950s when the Marine Corps proposed to put up this monument in Arlington. Various arts committees fought mightily against it because they did not like the statue. They didn't think it fit in with what they thought aesthetically Washington should be doing. But it was very hard to fight with Marines in that post-war period about honoring those who had fought on Iwo Jima in 1945. And Felix de Weldon was commissioned to do the statue in Arlington using the famous Joe Rosenthal photo. Inscribed on the base is Admiral Chester Nimitz's comment following Iwo Jima. "Uncommon valor was a common virtue," the Admiral said. And he listed on the base our heroic battles in which United States Marines have fought. But there's no talk of the 6,000 who died there, or the 22,000 who were injured there. There's no mention even that of the 6 men of the 12 sets of hands that are trying to push that flagpole up on the top of Mount Suribachi. The 3 of the 6 men who were there would never live to walk off of that island. They would die before the battle is over. Sacrifice is abstracted. Obviously, we've continued to evolve the way that we think about wars and how we remember those who sacrificed. And the Vietnam Memorial is an outlier in the modern era. The Vietnam Memorial whispers of sacrifice. You cannot possibly go to the Vietnam Memorial and look at these names and names and names and not be struck by how many young Americans were died there. There was some controversy, even though we've just celebrated 30 years since the dedication of the Vietnam Memorial. Remember, there was some controversy at that time because it was not heroic enough, many argued. Ross Perot led some of the opposition to it. Tom Wolfe, who went on to become a famous novelist, but Tom Wolfe wrote in the Washington Post 30 years ago that it was a tribute to Jane Fonda and the anti-war movement, and obviously no one thinks that today. As you look, as many of us have, at the families and the friends, the comrades going down the wall and looking at the names and stopping and weeping at one. This is not a tribute to Jane Fonda or anyone else. It's a reminder of those who fought in a war. The Korean War Memorial was constructed after that across the mall from the Vietnam Memorial. I find that a very powerful memorial as well. And it shows 19 figures walking through a field, their faces showing the expressions of men at war. And of course, the World War II Memorial, which opened last of these three modern memorials in 2005, the World War II Memorial speaks of the triumph of democracy. And sacrifice there is abstracted. There are 4,000 stars. Each star represents 1,000 Americans who died during that war. No names are engraved there. In these memorials and eulogies, grand national purpose requires sacrifice. Those who step up are heroic, and there's little discussion of the human cost. I would argue that in some ironic and perhaps even some cruel and perverse ways, there is nothing more human than war. There are two things that we teach our children when we raise them. From the time that they're toddlers, we teach them to be careful about putting themselves at risk. Don't touch that, don't go there, be careful. We want them to learn to take care of themselves. Secondly, we teach them not to harm other people. That's not simply the belief of our family. It's also in the code of our laws, the teachings of our churches and our temples and our synagogues and our schools. Don't harm other people. Then we take these 18 or 19-year-olds and send them to basic training or boot camp. We say, now you have to forget both of those things. You must be prepared to put yourself at tremendous risk. And you must be prepared to bring lethal harm to others. Then after a few years of serving in a war, they come home and we say, now you forget those lessons you just learned and go back to the old principles. And they do, they live their lives by the old principles, but those who have served in combat, who have put their own lives at risk and have been engaged in activities that took other lives, they never forget these experiences. I heard a Vietnam veteran on Veterans Day just a couple days ago talking on a radio show about what he called the viciousness that is war. And he reflected that his experience in war, quote, ran completely against my nature. And of course, we would not want it any other way. It has to run against their nature, but we're asking them to do this on behalf of us and our country. The Marine Corps commercial, the Marine Corps does very good commercials, and the commercial this spring showing a number of, there's fire and explosions and shooting, and it shows men rushing out of helicopters or off of boats, and the theme is running toward the sound of chaos. Who is it that runs toward the sound of chaos? We are taught to run away from chaos. But these young Marines, and of course young soldiers as well, are taught to run toward the sounds of chaos. There's obviously nothing that's more human, more personal, more tragic than the sacrifice that war demands. Today, an unrepresentative military fights and sacrifices, and they fight in wars in which it is harder to describe the purpose, the rationale. How many people could really lay out this? This is the military purpose. This is what the Army and the Marines are going to have to accomplish in Afghanistan over the next 2 years. This is the military purpose. Those who are fighting there are unknown to most of us, and anonymity in these wars is not a result of the scale, but it's because most of us don't know those who fight. Most Americans don't understand the nature of defensive wars, don't understand the rules of engagement that have been imposed upon these young men and women who are fighting today. Most of us don't understand wars without clear objectives and clearly identified enemies. World War II was so easy, unconditional surrender. We knew who we were fighting, and there were no restraints, really, on the way that we fought them and the weapons that we used. These wars today are often reduced to distant video game wars in places we've never heard of. But these are real wars to those who fight them. Most of us have lost this insight, have lost the personal dimension of support. When we think about this, and certainly as a country, we did not think about it very much in this last election campaign, and I don't mean simply at the presidential level, I mean up and down the slates. We didn't think very much about what this means, what it is that still tonight, right now, people are doing on our behalf. And we do think about it in response to some heroic, even abstracted others who fight. War is not so neat, and it's essential for those who would send people to war to understand the cruel character of war and the obligations that we all incur following these wars. I conclude by reading a couple of pages from my book where I reflect on this in a way that is relevant perhaps here. The week following Memorial Day 2011, my wife Susan and I visited Gettysburg. I had last been there in the spring of 1957 on my Galena High School senior class trip to Washington, and Susan had never been there. It was a profoundly moving experience for us. On a warm June morning, we stopped at peaceful places with pastoral names: the wheat field, the peach orchard, Plum Run, the Rose Farm, bucolic places like the McPherson's Barn, the Culp Farm, and the Kadori Farm. We looked at a long line of Confederate cannons ironically resting on Seminary Ridge. Across a gentle valley, Union canyons faced them. They sat on a peaceful cemetery ridge. The fields and hills in and around this community were filled with stilled and spiked cannons and with monuments to individuals, to battles, to military units, to states. By one count, there are 1,300 monuments, solid works of bronze or granite that silently memorialize. The southern states were reluctant in the early years to establish monuments at Gettysburg. In the 20th century, they did. The North Carolina monument is striking. A bronze sculpture by Gutzon Borglum, who did the famous sculpting on the face of Mount Rushmore. This monument has 5 figures in it. Each wears the look of a man engaged in a very emotional experience. One is downed with wounds and is urging his friends to advance. Another is young and scared. Others are resolute. The sculpture is positioned on Seminary Ridge near the fields where a North Carolina brigade went to join in Pickett's bloody and unsuccessful charge on the 3rd and final day of the battle. The 26th North Carolina Regiment had suffered extremely heavy casualties on the first day of battle at McPherson's Ridge, and the remnants then joined with Pickett on day 3. They suffered 82% casualties in these 2 days at Gettysburg, the highest of any regiment on either side of the battle. This included, by some accounts, 4 sets of twins, all of whom were killed or wounded. Across from the North Carolina monument, we stood at the angle, that place where the old stone wall on Cemetery Ridge moved sharply perpendicular. Here was the high point of the Confederate charge, a high point touched but never held. A small remnant of the 26th North Carolina planted their colors here briefly, and a monument marks the spot where Brigadier General Lewis Armistead was mortally wounded when leading a charge into the Union lines. A few hundred yards away, Abraham Lincoln delivered his address, inaugurating the cemetery. Looking out from the angle to the west and northwest is a long sloping field that was a major killing ground. Now a meadow in the summer of 1863, it was corn and wheat and clover. The Emmitsburg Road, a country lane, meanders through, and its wooden fence evokes pastoral nostalgia. On July 3, 1863, the fence that stood there was an obstacle that slowed the charging Confederates and made them even better targets for Union fire. Over 3 days in early July 1863, there were more than 50,000 casualties in the fields around Gettysburg. Some 7,900 men died. Gettysburg is as good a place as any to reflect on the meaning of America's wars and the sacrifices they have required. Such reflections need to acknowledge that they cannot provide absolute answers or generalizable meanings. Each war and each battle in each war were different. But here, around this little Pennsylvania town, finally the momentum of this great and terrible war shifted. There would be more bloody battles, but the Union would be preserved, and it would be a Union without human slavery. If these are causes worth fighting for, and I believe they are, it would require more providential judgment or simple arrogance than I care to inflict in order to proclaim that these causes worth fighting for were also worth someone else dying for. But if we've learned anything, it is that the one always follows the other. The more abstractly the deaths are counted, perhaps the easier to rationalize their sacrifices. Among compilations of numbers on reports and then names chiseled in stone, there are very human stories to be told. Numbers obscure names, and in time even names fade away from signifying human beings doing difficult things and dying too soon, or suffering from a lifetime the trauma of a single moment. Undefined wars are dangerous things. Undefined, unknown, anonymous warriors are more than dangerous. They allow wars stripped of the very human dimension and understanding of personal sacrifice that are necessary consequences of war. The heroic narratives of war and the abstract celebration of warriors do sanitize wars by stripping them of their personality. It is hard to take the personal stories of combat and fit them easily into the heroic narrative. Moreover, if Lincoln would instruct us to remember our obligation to ensure that those who died on this, quote, hallowed ground did not die in vain, what about grounds less hallowed or even less remembered? Did those who died on Pork Chop Hill in Korea, or Hamburger Hill in Vietnam, or the Korengal Valley in Afghanistan, all places marked by fierce fighting, they were later determined to be strategically unnecessary. Did they then die in vain? I hope not. But declaring these things is beyond my specialty. Nonetheless, each of these places is a reminder of what it is we ask young people to do. Neil Sheehan wrote of Hamburger Hill in Vietnam, quote, it ought to be one thing to perish on the beaches of Normandy or Iwo Jima in a great cause, and another to fall in a rejected and unsung war, end of quotation. I'm not sure who gets to define the oughts of these things, nor am I positive it is different for those who fall or for their families. Thank you very much for inviting me out here.